Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Empyre number 6. So, this book is we've talked about every issue in Empyre thus far, and you can check out all of those reviews here on Comic Island. But as always, the story was done by Al Ewing and Dan Slott, script by Al Ewing himself, art by Valerio Schiti, and coloring by Marde Garcia. Joe Carmagna doing the lettering. And I started out pretty excited about Empyre. I thought it had a pretty promising premise. Plus, Al Ewing, in my eyes, is a pretty talented writer, and I thought he had a lot of potential to really tell us a fun Marvel crossover event. And in my opinion, the last couple of years of Marvel events have been relatively strong. A few issues into Empyre, and it quickly became apparent that what could have been a promising story about the Kree and Skrull empires unifying and the change in dynamics and politics that would have, as well as their fleet just showing up around Earth at the beginning of this event, all felt like a pretty cool idea. Ended up just being a story about plant aliens invading Earth and a prolonged battle against them. And this final book doesn't really change a lot of that, but I will say this before we get into everything that happens with this book. While I found the last 4 or 5 issues of Empyre quite disappointing, issue number 6 is relatively strong. It's kind of long and ends the event, which has been pretty lackluster, on a relatively good note in terms of quality. I definitely felt there was more to this issue, and I definitely liked more of this comic than the last few. All told, it kind of cements Empyre as not a good event, but definitely not a terrible one either. And I would definitely rank it kind of right in the middle of all the Marvel crossovers out there. Above real duds like Age of Ultron or Secret Invasion, in my opinion, but below some of the better stuff, even more recent things like War of the Realms or Absolute Carnage. Because a lot of events like this have a relatively weak ending. Even some pretty strong events that I quite like have pretty weak endings. So for this one to kind of end things in a relatively strong place, to have some good moments in it, some excellent artwork as always, and promise of some relatively interesting potential changes to the status quo in the future in a way that kind of reflects the growing trend within Marvel these days. It's an okay book. And it's an okay event on the whole because it has all those features. It's still not the best thing in the world. It still definitely gets bogged down with pointless drama around the Katati, which just aren't as exciting as the Kree or the Skrull, but it does have some great moments between the Avengers and the Fantastic Four as well. And on the whole, it's certainly better than the last few issues of Empyre. I don't think I'd recommend it, but it does leave the overall Marvel canon in a pretty positive place and has me excited about some of these changes, even if a lot of some of the more obvious event stuff was walked back in this book. Like every comic book death in Empyre thus far is completely erased in this story, and I don't mind giving that away, but maybe that's a good time for us to get into spoiler territory, because I think that's a pretty good review, spoiler free. So we open on Reed Richards and Tony Stark, with Reed in his new Iron Man suit, I guess, but it's very Fantastic Four themed. They talk about the overall current situation and what they know. Reed agrees to go off and try and stop the Katati in Wakanda, who have taken root there. And Tony decides to deal with the sun potentially exploding in 8 minutes. They bring forward a couple of tie-in stuff dealing with the new Fantastic Four, with Wolverine and Spider-Man getting a little cameo here. It's nothing super substantial, but it's there. And then we cut to the throne ship and the Kree and the Skrull are currently dealing with the chaos of not only this weird psychic thing forcing all the Kree and the Skrull everywhere to fight each other, but also the emergence of the real Hulkling. Uh, Meanwhile, Wiccan, Captain Marvel, and the Human Torch agree to teleport basically to like direct orbit around the sun so they can kind of combine their powers to try and stop this reaction from destroying everything. It gets some really good artwork and a nice little moment for these three characters who aren't like top tier level names. Like Captain Marvel's the big name at this point, and the Human Torch, but it feels cool that Wiccan gets to share this moment with them. And the Young Avengers in general got a little bit of a time in the spotlight in this story, which is kind of cool. So all that's coming to a head. Meanwhile, Planted She-Hulk is rampaging and really just decimating Mantis, Invisible Woman, and the Thing. The Invisible Woman, like Sue has an interesting moment here where she gets Mantis to block like any feedback from her body in terms of pain or holding her back whatsoever, so that she can kind of pin down the She-Hulk no matter like her formidable strength. And the Thing has a great little moment where he tries to talk her down, paired with Valeria and Franklin doing the same thing to the little Kree Skrull children we got introduced to in the Fantastic Four series. That basically is causing the whole little psychic thing that's forcing the Kree and the Skrull to fight. Collectively, this all kind of brings She-Hulk back to normal and stops the reaction, allowing the Kree and the Skrull to stop battling each other. They all take a moment and realize that the fake Hulkling is indeed fake and the real one is wearing the inhibitor mask. But for now, three members of the throne room, Glory, the Super Skrull, and Morgan, all teleport to the sun to try and stop the reaction and join with the humans doing so, which is a cool little moment. Black Panther then emerges. Apparently he's fine. He used some expert training to slow his pulse down to nil, so everyone thought he was dead. We're just throwing all those deaths away in this final issue. Reed Richards and stretchy Iron Man suit kind of shows up and manages to disable Koi's control over the plants. And he arrives with a bunch of other Avengers, and they all kind of try and get Koi to stand down. Meanwhile, they're outside of the sun. Stark's doing something to try and work with those guys to stop the sun reaction from happening. And the fake Hulkling is, of course, revealed to be the Empress, and I think Hulkling's grandmother. She knocks the inhibitor mask off of him, but they couldn't get it off of Hulkling, so now that it's off, he basically says, "Oh, you in your rage, you basically exposed yourself to like my weakness," and pins her with the inhibitor mask, and is able to disable her and kind of show his strength to the Empire. So then there's a big battle against Koi and the swordsman. Thor shows up from a cut tie-in that was canceled due to the pandemic, and he zaps a bunch of plant people, ranting about Mother Gaia, which I guess is what his adventure was supposed to be about. And Swordsman has a cool moment where he threatens his own son, basically to get everyone to try and stand down, and it's clearly a desperate moment. Black Panther has this cool moment where he's like, "I knew the real swordsman, and you're no swordsman," like he died an Avenger. Yet, knowing the Avenger comics, I don't know if that moment's really fully earned, but nevertheless, he uses swordsman's body to destroy the little egg thing they had built in Wakanda. That would have been their little launch pad to invade the rest of the galaxy, pretty much. Koi rants and raves, but is captured. His mother tries to talk him down, but he clearly has been lost to the swordsman's sway. And then things sort of calm down, and everyone sort of talks about where things have settled. It's kind of interesting that the Korean Skrull forces are now more unified than ever because of this, but also have tremendous respect for the human race because of all that. A kind of earned moment, but, the human race held firm against 3 invading alien armies at once, and that's something, I guess. And they also managed to broker this peace, restore the Emperor, and defeat this huge threat that the Kree and Skrull were truly worried about and basically unified over. So that secures the Hulkling's place at the throne room, but with Hulkling at his side and Captain Marvel retaining her position as lead accuser, and that's where the book ends. So a lot of faults that kind of tie into the larger issues with Empyre as a whole. Those deaths of She-Hulk and Black Panther were utterly pointless, but everyone could have called that the second that they happened. At least they didn't really drag it out beyond this event. I think the direction of Carol becoming an accuser and the whole idea of the Kree Skrull Empire being unified and that changing galactic politics, along with the humans kind of securing a spot in that political landscape, is pretty interesting and kind of gets into the stuff Empyre should have been about and really should have been a key part of this story, as opposed to stuff that can potentially be followed up on before. Other people, and I have said it too, wish that the Kree-Skrull alliance and how it was formed could have been more of the thrust of this story, and it should have been more earned across this event, which is kind of what they tried to do in this event, but really it barely pays off. It's interesting how Tony Stark does kind of save the day while not even leaving Avengers Mountain and basically working in a cave, just cobbling tech together, which he says is at his core of his being and where he was born as Iron Man, which is something. But I think the stronger moment is definitely the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, and these various figures in the Kree-Skrull Alliance working together to solve this problem. It's a damn cool moment when we have these 6 figures: Wiccan, Captain Marvel, Human Torch, the Super Skrull, Morgan, and Captain Glory, all working together to stop the sun from exploding and save the Earth. That's a cool little moment that reflects this theme of unity that really should have been explored across these books a little more, as opposed to not at all. But I think, like I was saying in the spoiler-free chunk of this review, I really do believe that there is a direction for it that fits in with the larger theme, I guess we'll say, or trend is maybe a better word, within Marvel books and the direction they're kind of going with a lot of these stories right now, which is this sense of progress and development that I really haven't seen before in the modern age. They've tried stuff like this, but really not to this level that feels appropriate given the age and amount of stuff that's happened to these characters over this time. What I mean by that is House of X, all that stuff from Jason Aaron's run with the Avengers and then becoming Avengers Mountain, Wakanda taking over for S.H.I.E.L.D. Everything's kind of amping up a little bit, but in a positive way, where these heroes have earned this new level of status. And that's where I think there's a lot of potential in the future for humanity to take this larger place in galactic politics, for the Avengers to be bigger and more powerful than they've ever been before. That stuff I think is really cool. Marvel's universe is resembling the real world less and less every day, and I'm not really against that, because I think that ship sailed a very long time ago, and any sense of realism was gone with the Savage Land, Genosha, all these classic elements of Marvel history that have made the world fantastical and fun to begin with. So we might as well progress. It's been going in that direction for a very long time anyways, and this stuff kind of works for me. The Avengers used to live in a very large house. Now they live in a dead celestial body. That's cool as hell. And Empyre, on a very basic level, fits the theme. However, I will say this. The consequences of Empyre can basically be felt in other books and explored going forward without anyone even having to bother to read these Empyre books. They are utterly pointless, and they do very little to establish humanity's new place in all of this, or anything going on with like this future I'm describing, or like how the Kree Skrull alliance was built. It's referred to in Empyre, but we see very little of that beyond bits of flashbacks that talk about this struggle. Tevye Smoka and Jamcal, thanks for joining me. Tevye was saying I thought this event was boring. I largely don't disagree because of all that problems, but I really think it was close. And like I said earlier, having a relatively strong ending does put it quite a bit higher than several other Marvel events. So it's definitely not the worst thing I've ever read, but it's not great, and I definitely wouldn't recommend this issue or the event on the whole. Though this is much better than issues 3, 4, 5, and 6, even 2. So like I said, 4 or 5 issues, like it hasn't been that good to begin with. And yeah, that's all I particularly have to say about Empyre at this point. We've talked a lot about that, but I really do think the exciting element of it all is that future. There is potential in Marvel, and it does feel like an exciting time for the overall franchise because they're kind of pushing barriers in a way that feels like more compared to like the past iteration of Marvel's modern age. Like we're progressing in a way that's more comparable to the stuff that Stan Lee would do. Or just like we're progressing forward. There's a new status quo going on, and it's cool and different and very imaginative. So it's nice to see, and hopefully Marvel can develop on that. Because there ain't nothing here, but there is that potential. Now Tevye makes a great point, and one I wanted to make but I forgot. And he says at least Wiccan and Hulkling are married, and that is something to Empyre's credit. Like everything I've said, I maintain. It's very mediocre, very middle of the road when it comes to Marvel events, but there are consequences that can be felt beyond this, and it is kind of cool. Like when we talk about Empyre, it features the Korean Skrull being unified, this crazy invasion with, admittedly, some very fun tie-ins accompanying it, even after quite a few were canceled. And we also have the, like, aside from the change in intergalactic politics, the wedding of Hulkling and Wiccan, which is something that can be felt like as something significant, and it's kind of cool they tied this into the event, and the Young Avengers felt quite relevant in this story, which is always nice to see because I'm a fan of that team. Alejandro Milchi was saying it was boring, but at least it didn't ruin any character. Well, one could argue it ruined Mantis and even the Celestial Messiah, but I would argue no one really cares about either of those characters. Even at, like, as someone who's been reading a lot of Avengers books lately and has kind of gained an affinity for certain characters, I don't particularly care about Swordsman, who, to be fair, was like part of the Avengers books way back in the day from like the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby era. So it is kind of cool how Empyre brings up a lot of that stuff, but it's to no effect, and I question the point of it all. Alejandro says, like other past events, referring to what he's saying about other stuff ruining characters. And I strongly agree with that. That could have very easily happened with Carol Danvers becoming an accuser. And I could say something like that could even compromise her character and explore that darkness a little bit in a positive way that doesn't ruin her. But more broadly, we didn't have Tony Stark becoming a fascist or anything terrible like that. In fact, I would argue it did a pretty good job at living up to these characters and repairing what little damage it did with characters like She-Hulk, who remains an interesting element of the whole Jason Aaron Avengers line. I really feel like she recovered in part because she was recently touched by the Celestials, and something's going on with her. Jam Calax was saying, will Emperor Hulkling be pressured to produce in an eventual heir, or will he adopt the Kree boy and Skull girl as potential heirs through the possible arranged marriage? Wait, that gets into, like, one would hope an incredibly advanced society like the Kree or the Skrull would have some form of democracy. I know they don't, but maybe Hulkling can kind of push them in that direction and remove the terrible, terrible idea of inherited power. you bring some interesting points, and it's something that I think Hulkling and Wiccan will still have to contend with. But I think this newfound respect means that even if they have to do something like that, they probably won't kick out um, Wiccan. Also, based on what we've established with Skrulls, there's no reason that couple can't have children. Let's just put it that way. That's a cool element of the Skrulls that most of them seem pretty positive about. For example, I think they all have an interesting view of gender and stuff, and might not be dead set against it anymore. It'll be interesting to see how far they go with this respect earned for humanity. I admit it's not earned, but it would be interesting because that's a huge change in how humanity is treated by the galaxy at large. And I think that might be earned based on what we know now about where humanity comes from and its weird, long-standing relationship to the Celestials being explained a little more at this point in a way that makes humanity important without us being some sort of weirdly, like, special race. We are, according to Marvel lore, but it was mostly just a random accident. Just a Celestial happened to land on our planet and die, and then the Celestials kind of made use of that. But it was all... I like that element of Jason Aaron's Avengers run that I think kind of bleeds into the larger current ethos of Marvel, where it's like, well, like humanity and all this stuff was kind of an accident, but it explains where all the superpowers and stuff comes from because they had this genetic affinity built into them and encouraged by the Celestials. Because of that, it makes sense that they would take more of a root in galactic politics. But it's not cheesy in the way that, say, Jeff Johns made it that, like, Earth was secretly the origin of all life in the universe, which still doesn't make sense to me. Like, this whole idea of humanity being special in the context of as it's currently written in Marvel does make sense to me, because it doesn't lionize humanity. It just sort of explains how, thus far, superheroes have been able to be active in intergalactic politics, even though humanity is this teeny tiny little planet that, like, shouldn't have so many superheroes compete with these advanced races and their superpowers. So that's very effective, is what I'm getting at. Collectively, it Marvel's in a good place for telling fun stories, and I think that keeps showing. Maybe it hasn't happened in Empyre, but I think beyond that, it's got some interesting elements going for it. Tevi is saying, agreed, unlike Secret Empire, this event had a happy ending. Well, that's a good example of a story that really compares favorably. Because yes, Empire is pointless, but at least it has an ending that gets me more excited about Marvel as opposed to less. And that's great. And then Tevi brings up Civil War 2. Yeah, same thing. I think a lot of people in chat are kind of correctly bringing up that Empire doesn't make all of the mistakes that the terrible Marvel events make, even though Empire does make some of those mistakes. And it's all the better for it. Yeah, I don't really know what your last little bit of chat refers to, Jam Calyx, but yeah. So overall, well, I think you should have a pretty good impression of how I feel about Empire. I definitely was impressed by this particular issue. It could have been a lot worse, and this one wasn't too bad. It wasn't amazing, but it was a pretty strong ending to a very mediocre event, and definitely improves my overall opinion of the event, even if I still think it was just not worth your time or money. Yeah, and we'll leave it at that. Oh, I see. Jamcal is saying humanity has become this sort of wild card because of all that stuff I was saying about the Celestials, and I think that's what they were designed to be, as a sort of happy accident. But it makes so much sense. Like, the Celestials wouldn't care about humanity normally. One of their brothers died on the planet and affected it in a pretty interesting way, and they decided to make use of it in a way that ultimately really paid off for them. But you have to read the first book of Avengers to fully understand what I'm getting at there. But what I'm getting at there, I think, is reflective of what's going on in Empire. And in that regard, it's a pretty good follow-up. And I do like... Empire is also a good thesis statement of, like, well, the new Avengers team, as it currently exists, it's just called Avengers. So not to confuse it with the new Avengers series or anything like that. But Avengers as they exist under Jason Aaron does work in an entertaining way in other stories under other writers. They didn't do a great job with Empyre, but the problem wasn't the status quo with the Avengers. If anything, that was a huge strength. Ghost Rider turning the Quinjet into a flaming vehicle weapon at the start of the story was awesome as hell. And that sort of thing played out in terms of like Wakanda being a big part of this story and Black Panther being a major figure, which makes sense if you read those Avengers books. All that stuff with the Avengers Mountain being a setting, but also just the identity of the team itself. It works well even when Jason Aaron isn't involved, which is a good sign for the future of the Avengers and Marvel in general, I think, in spite of a pretty mediocre book. Now, I still have a ton of books to review because I ended up with this crazy poll this week that it just included a bunch of books delayed up until now. So next up, we're going to talk about Batman and the latest chapter in the Joker War. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for everyone who joined and was talking to us throughout this video. And, well, to me, I should say. And, or at each other, I guess. And, yeah, you all have a good one. And I'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.